Hello, and welcome to the official podcast of the Georgia Game Developers Association. The following is part of a series of recordings made during the 2011 Southern Interactive Entertainment and Game Expo. In this session, Eric Church presents Serious versus Entertainment Game Design and Production. While the technologies of serious games are similar to entertainment games, their design and production processes often differ. This session uses the production cycle of both to introduce the differing design and production considerations, funding methods, technical requirements, client differences, and the requirement of working with instructional design and subject matter experts each affect the creation of serious games. Eric Church draws upon his 15 years as a game designer to highlight the process and discuss how making a serious game presents challenges and opportunities not found in entertainment games. The Georgia Game Developers Association now presents Eric Church.
Shall I go ahead and start?
Yes.
Hi,
Hello.
my name's Eric Church, and I'm a serious games designer for Breakaway Games. And before I get too much into what I want to talk about, I'm going to tell you a little story of something that happened about a year ago too. I was working on this project called Edge P, and the idea was to create an MMO that was going to train soldiers heading to Afghanistan and who had been in field in Afghanistan. They want to train them about the environment, train them about what sort of interactions they're going to have with people. And they had already come up with a lot of what the design was going to be. They had actually already gone out and purchased a massively multiplayer online engine, and we were brought in to build it. And very early on, I'm looking through the design, and there's a call for this to be first person. And there's a lot of assumptions that go with what's a first-person shooter versus a third-person shooter, and how the players interact with that game, how they relate to the characters. And we felt that being a third-person game was much more important for the kinds of interactions they were interested in. They wanted interactions that had to do with, how do I relate to the environment? How do I relate to these other people? And to do that appropriately, a first-person shooter, which is really sort of the equivalent of looking down a cardboard tube, it wasn't appropriate. So I prepared this whole speech and put together a bunch of PowerPoint slides to explain to them why they really wanted a third-person point of view and not a first-person point of view. And I went through this whole thing, big phone conference with the client, and as we're getting on, I showed something very similar to this. This is actually where we ended up, but a mock-up of it in third person. And one of them said, yeah, that's what we wanted. We wanted first person. We didn't want it jumping around from person to person. We just wanted it attached to one character. And what I realized is they were thinking of it in these sort of literary terms of first person. I'm relating to one person, not in terms of what games are. And the important thing that I really, I kind of had already known this, but it was really a really useful lesson to me, which is you really kind of need to understand who your audience is and who it is you're talking to. So before I go on any further and talk about what I'm planning on talking about here, which is this process of how the processes between entertainment games and serious games are different in especially the early development, getting a deal and pre-production, I want to know who my audience is. So how many people in here are connected to serious games already working in serious games? And how many people in here are connected to entertainment games and working in that field? And so that helps me a little bit. How many people are actually not developers but looking to deal with serious games as purchasers, as publishers, whatever, however you want to see that relationship? Okay, great. So that helps me a little bit. It's kind of a big mix, so we'll see how this works for everybody. But what I really want to do is talk about who I am, sort of some of my background, because I think it kind of illustrates what I think you're going to see more and more of with the serious games world and where people are coming from, where the talent's coming from, and where the companies are coming from. Then I want to talk a lot about the process of getting a deal, at least the most common ways of getting a deal, and make some comparisons between entertainment games and serious games. And then I want to talk some about the pre-production process, because I think that's where a lot of the biggest differences exist, and where a lot of, everybody knows that's where both entertainment games and serious games tend to go wrong, is in pre-production. So, and I may get to a little bit about, what happens after you produce the game and what you have to do to ship and install it and everything, but we'll see about that. And I just want to let everyone know, I don't know, I've tried this speech out, I'm not sure how long it is, so I think I've got time in here, but basically interrupt me at any time if you've got questions, if you've got comments. I'd really like this to be much more a dialogue, because we've got a lot of people in the audience who are at least as experienced as I am, if not more so, who have other interesting experiences. I really want to get as much of this about everybody talking to everybody, as opposed to just me standing up here running my mouth. So one of the things I want to say is that everybody's experience, and especially in serious games, could be a lot different from what I'm talking about here. Is that one of the things I really like about serious games is I'm constantly getting new and interesting challenges. It's constantly different. The business models are changing constantly. The production process is different. All the clients are different. Every single game I've made so far, every simulation I've worked on has been significantly different, and what any of you may experience or may have experienced in the past could be significantly different from what I'm talking about. So that's my little preamble. And now to talk about who I am. I came from the entertainment world. I worked on a lot of military shooters. I started out at a company that was strangely started by a couple people from the Army Research Lab. So there's been this sort of continuum of entertainment and serious throughout my entire career. But I spent a lot of time working on these military first and third person shooters. A lot of them people probably have heard of. In the Medal of Honor series, I worked on the first three, and then I also worked on the first console Call of Duty. And that was a process that let me do a lot of learning about how you take a world, how you take an existing world and an existing set of knowledge and make it entertaining and make it exciting to people. But it also shows a lot of what's different about serious games and entertainment games, because in the entertainment games, we used the world of World War II in particular as a veneer. We weren't too worried about accuracy. We weren't too worried about how it, what it was, the specifics. And in a lot of cases, we accidentally or on purpose, we were miseducating people. There's times, at one point, we got a letter from somebody from a teacher who sent us this copy of a report that was submitted by one of their kids that was the story of Jimmy Patterson, who was our main character in the first couple games, and how he won a Medal of Honor. And it was entirely made up. But this kid had taken this and taken it as reality. Now, on the one hand, it shows a lot of the power of what you can do with these games. This kid knew these stories inside and out. He knew a lot about World War II because of these games. But it also meant that, like this way that we were playing Fast and Loose with the truth was part of what let us do that. And the company I work at is Breakaway. Started out in a similar sort of vein. Breakaway started out as a entertainment game. They came out of the ashes in the Maryland area of Microprose. And if anybody's been playing PC games for a long time, there's a whole history of the early PC games, some of the great early PC games, and some of the very the simulation games, the chopper games and the tank games from the PCs in the 90s were put out by Microprose. And we've got a lot of people who came from that background are now working with us and elsewhere in the valley north of Baltimore. But over time, right after they started, they had some contacts with the military, and they were doing some games, like helping out, putting together war games. They put together a system called entropy-based warfare that was used to run war games. And now when I say war games, I don't mean war games necessarily how a lot of us think of them. Certainly, it was a learning process for me because I grew up playing war games. I worked at a place called War Games West, and that was a place that sold board games, Squad Leader, War in the Pacific, these giant epic board games with little cardboard chips, but those were war games. Now, when you talk about a war game in some other situations, a war game is necessary. It's a moderated process. You get a bunch of people in and they play a game, but it's all a verbal process, and then the actual systems of the game are hidden away, or even just some guy making an arbitrary decision. And we came up with, for Breakaway, developed a system called entropy-based warfare that helped to run those, that created some of the entropy that occurs in large-scale warfare. Over time, Breakaway did that and continued doing entertainment games, doing games that were expansions for existing real-time strategy games, city-building games. So a big variety of entertainment games and working in the entertainment business. But the serious business continued to expand. And eventually, especially with the crash, we decided to back away from the entertainment games entirely. It's very difficult to maintain the two, because when you're working with a large publisher, the large publishers expect to be the center of the universe. When you're working on a game for Electronic Arts, and Electronic Arts says, no, we want everybody in your company working on our game right now to make it as good as possible, you don't have a lot of choice. You either do that or you move on. And so Breakaway chose to move on and concentrate solely on serious games and work with government, work with corporate training, and build that business up. So what's the difference? What's the difference between these two processes of getting a deal in the entertainment world and a deal in the serious world? In the entertainment world, there's sort of this official standard method of getting a deal. Is you put together a sell sheet, and if you're good, you put together a demo or else a video. You have some sample of what the game's going to look like. You have a design overview. You have some of the technical approach. You have a company prospectus that describes how your company's background is, who your team members are. You have the technical design. You have some analysis of what your competition is. You put all this together, and you go out and you start shopping it around to different publishers. What you're trying to do is get this deal that is going to be an advance against royalties for the game you're going to produce. So in theory, these people are giving you the money that you're going to go then make for them. And it's a little bit broken in that sense. But the good thing is that you put these materials together, and then you can shop them around until somebody is interested in the product. And you get feedback every time you do it, so you're constantly improving on this one product. And eventually you will, hopefully, get a publishing deal. And that's very different from what I experienced once I started doing serious games. Serious games come out, usually there's a request that comes to you. There's a request that's published, most of them by the government is where most of our work is still coming from, although I think it's both because of contractions in the amount the government is spending and in the growing acceptance of serious games as a training methodology. That's moving to more of a corporate world, but the process is still very similar. Somebody puts out a request for proposals, and in the case of the government, these are actually published on a website. You get to see all of them that are coming out. You kind of monitor for something that's going to match what your skill set is, what your technology is capable of doing. And you put together a proposal that will hopefully get you this deal. And just so you can start getting used to some of the alphabet soup, if you're not familiar with this world already, this is some of what you're seeing. You'll see requests for information, an RFI. You'll see an RFP. You'll see BAAs. You'll see SIBRs and STTRs, which are a specific, strange little world of their own. And in general, you just have to start to learn to unfold all of these different letters, all these different acronyms, because it just keeps going, and you're always going to be able to more and more of these to go. I want to walk through a specific specific request for proposal that we went through that we were successful on recently, and to give you an idea of the timeline, because that's the other thing that's very different, is in entertainment games, you'd go out, you'd have a deal, and for the most part, you would know pretty quickly whether or not you were going to be able to sign a deal with the publisher. You'd go to the publisher, you'd contact them. If they thought you were even worth talking to, they'd bring you in. You'd do a little bit of focus testing through their company, but within a month or two, you would know if you had a deal. It's been very different for me in the serious games world. This project I got to see really from beginning to end for the entire proposal process. And this was this project called IARPA Series. Now, IARPA is the intelligence equivalent of DARPA. And if anybody's familiar with DARPA, DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. They're the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Agency. DARPA is responsible for a lot of the really high-end technology that the military does. And IARPA is a slightly more recent invention that they're trying to do the same thing. And they've started focusing a little bit on games and seeing what games can do for us and what games can do effectively. And this was the second of those that they did. And it started out with just a request for information, an RFI. They just sent something out saying, hey, tell us what you think is interesting in serious games. Tell us what you think you could do using a game to train, and submit a paper. And so we put together a response to this RFI and submitted it along with a bunch of other companies. And that process of writing it took a good deal of time. The process of waiting for them to go through all those and read them and respond to them took a little bit more time. And eventually they announced so that all started in March of 2010. In May of 2010, they held a workshop. They brought together the people who had produced what they thought were the most interesting papers, and had a large round table, and we all kind of presented what we had done our research on, and we had a lot of back and forth. It was actually one of the most interesting workshops I've gotten to attend in a long time, because this was some of the smartest people in games, in serious games, and in trying to figure out what works with games. And this big range of university professors and people from other competitors, and we all sat in a room and talked about what these different areas that we were interested in. And they'd sort of categorized everything into one group one day talking about flow and how flow works. And if you were in the previous session, there was a lot of talk about how flow works in a game. There's a whole set of us who had done papers that sort of addressed that. And then there was people who were talking about how virtualization works and how people's perception of themselves is addressed by games, and how that can shape what they do. And then there was a group talking about how mechanics can be applied to specific learning. Over this course of this couple days, we did that, and then we sat down with the program director, Dr. Rita Bush, and worked out some of what might go into an eventual BAA, which is a broad agency announcement, which is a specific form of a request for proposal. Some of what might go into a proposal to try and get people to mitigate cognitive biases. And cognitive biases are these processes, they're sort of heuristics that happen in your brain automatically. It's a very uncontrollable process. It's things that there are assumptions that you make that you sort of evolved making, that at one time it was a matter of being eaten by a saber-toothed tiger or running away. You need to make a decision really quickly. But now that we're in a modern world, a lot of these are a particular problem, and they're a huge problem for intelligence analysts. These analysts will make decisions based on these cognitive biases that don't necessarily reflect reality, and we end up making very bad decisions. We end up making decisions like, well, we think that's a viable target, and it turns out to be the Chinese embassy, not a Serbian military building. And that's the problem that they were trying to solve in this case. And we worked out with Rita Bush what some of the experimental variables you would want to look at trying to solve that, what sort of games could be used for that. And she went away and she said, okay, well, I'll be back, we'll make a broad agency announcement in a few months, and that will, then, hopefully all of you people will get together and put together some proposals for us. Well, it wasn't 3 months. It was closer to 6. There was an announcement of what's called an industry day. And this is a day when they've announced generally what the broad agency announcement is, and it's going to be, and get everybody into a room to sort of announce themselves, sell themselves, find out about what the project is going to be in more detail, but then also find partners. And that happened in January of this year. The full BAA actually came out in March. So once again, full year between when we first submitted this request for information and when we actually started seeing anything that was going to be work out of it.
In this long timeline leading up to the project launch, you're not guaranteed of any work at this point, and you're not being compensated. Is that correct?
There's absolutely no money coming to the company, and you're doing this all out of your own pocket. And there's not even a promise of, at the point of the first request for information, there's not even a guarantee that it's going to result in a broad agency announcement or a request for proposal. You're doing this work in the hopes of eventually producing work, but yeah, none of it is paid, none of it's compensated in any way. What's that?
On speculation.
Yeah, speculation.
So this announcement, is it possible that it won't even be a job for anyone?
It's
Is that what I'm
entirely
hearing?
possible.
So they may have an idea and like, nah, at the end of the whole.
So what actually happens internally, what happened internally at IARPA is Rita Bush had to go to her bosses and say, I'd like to get money, and we're talking about millions of dollars to try and fund this process. So making these games and doing this research. So yeah, it's
So the agency that the company that you work for has to have a stockpile of cash or other work or things that keep you afloat on these times of lull.
yeah, exactly. There's
contracts.
well, and for the most part, no one of these deals is going to keep you going, but it is very much you need to be distributed. And in fact, in some cases, there's an expectation that this not be the only thing you're working on. There was another proposal that we worked on for the World Bank that the requirement was that their money couldn't be more than 20% of your total income. So they wanted to make sure that they weren't the only thing funding you. So it's a little bit scary to be doing these requests for information, doing these requests for proposals, and putting them together is not an easy process. Eventually, the full proposal went in May, and in August they announced the phase 1 winners, and we actually we ended up teaming up and creating 3 different teams within our company. We had to do this very strange process where, because we're basically competing with ourselves but have found other partners, we had to keep people, but nobody within the company could talk to anybody else inside the company about what you were doing. So we had a
Were
Chinese
they legally separate entities within the same building?
No, it was just different personnel.
Oh.
So, and some of our accountants still knew what each of the proposals were, but the people who were interacting between the teams, they had to be isolated from each other, at least as far as what their workflow goes. I mean, we're working with each other on other projects, we're working with each other on other proposals, but for this proposal, I couldn't go to my colleagues and say, hey, I got this idea, let's bounce this around a little bit. So that was a little bit strange as well. So out of these 3 teams, we actually had 1 success, and the project kickoff is in a couple weeks. So here you are from early March of last year to October of this year before you saw any sort of money coming in, and that's a little rough for a business. And to give you an idea of how extensive these proposals are, this is part of the table of contents from the announcement. There's probably 50 pages in total, including some of it's very much boilerplate, where it's you've got to put together the things to control foreign nationals or making sure that you're not hiring illegal aliens. But a lot of it is actual content that you or other people on your proposal team have to put together. So
This is content as in
you're
work.
going to the proposal that you're going to submit.
Okay.
So the proposal was actually limited in size. There was 2 appendices that had to be 20 pages. And then the full proposal had to be 20 pages in addition. So we're putting together 60 pages of really crafted, good writing for something that may not see any money. And we actually did 3 of these. So all these requests for proposals, they tend to follow a similar format. And whether or not they're coming from someone like IARPA or someone like a corporate client, where they'll sort of lay out a goal, what they want to do with this product. They'll lay out some vision, and in a lot of cases, that vision is very specific. They have exactly what they think they need to do their training, to do their education. They'll have specifics in how they're going to deliver it, in what their budget and timeline is sometimes. Sometimes they'll publish their timeline. Sometimes people think that there's some advantage in keeping the budget secret. And then there's usually going to be a series of project phases. And what the project phases are is there will be a series of sort of go, no-go decision points in the project where you will get to the end of phase one, there will be a hard evaluation, and there's no guarantee that you get work after that phase. So depending on the project, that may be 3 months out of a total year project, it might be a year out of a 4-year project. So a lot of these have a lot of common problems, and now we're going to get to a little bit of a rant of mine. But so they have, like, I talked about this problem early on where I was talking, I described talking about a first-person game versus a third-person game, giving this whole spiel, and they were talking in very different terms. A lot of times these proposals will have very hard terminology in writing that you're responding to, but you're not sure if you're responding to what they think they're saying. It's the line from Princess Bride. I don't know if that word thinks it is, that means what you think it means. And there's also a problem of being in love with technology. They think that if they have some specific technology, it's going to solve their problem. It's going to make their serious game engaging. The biggest problem is that people think that 3D is better than 2D. That every time, if I can do this in 3D, it's going to be more effective training, that people will be more engaged, that it's going to get the kids to play it because it's in 3D. And in fact, that may or may not be the case. And in a lot of cases, you're dealing with a budget that doesn't really support 3D. You're talking about a budget of maybe a few $100,000. What you would have made a game in the early to mid 90s for. And they're expecting it to look like a AAA game that's out now that you would make for $20, $30 million. And so there's this process of trying to tell them what you're going to do with their work, how you're responding to this proposal, but you have to do it in a way that tells them they may not be right, but gently. And that's an ugly, ugly process. There's also a tendency to try and hide the budget. Not every time, but some people really want to keep that budget hidden. They're hoping to get people to start bidding competitively and underbidding each other by not telling you how much they have to spend. But all they're really doing is depriving you of information about what it is, what their expectations are, how much they're looking to spend.
So in other words, if you saw it to be a $10 million job and you bid it accordingly, they have a $200,000 budget, you may be wasting your time. So it's always best for you to have kind of an understanding of what they're looking for as budget and their budget restraints.
Yes, exactly. So,
how often is the occurrence in this space, I worked in it for a very little period of time, of companies to say, we can do this for $5 million, oops, we're going to need another $2 million to do it, but you've already spent $5 million, so you should probably give it to us. How often is it for companies to deliberately unpropose and then run over the budget?
I think I saw a lot more of that in entertainment. In entertainment, there was a degree, there was sometimes a feeling that if you could get in and get the company sold on it, and they started marketing it, and they started selling it up to their customers and potential customers in the entertainment field, that when you get to that point and realize, oh, oops, we can't possibly finish this for the amount of money you had budgeted, they get you more money. In a lot of cases with the government, it's a lot harder. The contracts are pretty strict. There are, we hear on the news about all these people getting lots and lots of extra money out of the government. I haven't found it happen once. Is there that you have contractual obligations, you're either going to meet those or you're going to fail and they're going to stop paying. And so
they'll never use you again.
Yeah, that's
right.
So you don't want to fail.
I work in that same space, and we have money up until this date, and once that date hits, we better be ready, or they're not going to pay us to support it. They're not going to pay us for an upgrade for this new feature, this new vehicle, and they'll take it to somebody else. So the reward is that they'll give you more work, but once they run out of money, you're out of money. And I don't know of any way you can convince them to give you more, just for fun. Can we have more just to make it cooler? No, you can't. No, it's too much red tape. Not happening.
Here, when you mentioned the comparison with AAA games, I've seen, and I wonder if you've seen two opposite poles there, pulling in two different directions. One is there are clients for serious games who feel like AAA game mechanics or aesthetics are negative because they will detract or distract from the learning agenda or the serious agenda. They're frosting on a cake that doesn't need frosting. And the other is they're so in love with the AAA aesthetics and mechanics, but they don't have the technology base in the company and the organization to support that. They don't have a pipeline.
Well, yeah, that's actually one of the huge problems you run into. Is people want 3D, they want this very advanced looking game, and oh, by the way, we're doing it on business desktops from about 4 years ago.
Yeah.
So you're there's no way you're going to be able to meet their expectations on their machine. So you're either delivering something that makes them sad every single time there's a product review, or you're delivering them something that there's never going to work for them in the end. And I don't know what the answer is. I mean, the other thing you were talking about, that people thinking that it's just icing on the cake, that it's not necessary. I've never run into that. That's not been my experience. I mean,
There's, in a review of research I did a few months ago, that came up quite a bit. Training managers, for example, feel that to the extent the game is engaging as an entertainment, it is undermining the serious purpose of the game, both in the mind of the player or employee and the organization that manages it.
Yeah, now that I can see. I thought we were just talking about in terms of, well, this looks too good.
No.
Now, there is sometimes where you're kind of trying to manage that process of, if you give them stuff that, especially if it's temporary art early on, the people you're dealing with don't understand the process of making games as well. So they'll look at stuff early on, and you want it to be very rough. If anybody's seen in Expression, I'll get you in a second. If anybody's seen an Expression Blend, there's Sketchflow, and they actually have a mock-up process that has all of the pre-made art, all of the buttons, all of the text is done as if it was hand-drawn. And it's a brilliant way of expressing to somebody that this is temporary. So the button looks temporary because it looks like somebody drew it with a pencil, and all the text looks temporary because it looks like somebody drew it with a pencil. So there's not this, well, yeah, but it's a little too blue, because they understand it's temporary. But that process is very important in dealing with customers.
About that specifically, in connection to his question, it seems like if the value of the thing in the case of like this a training simulation is to teach a task, then maybe the aesthetic or the aesthetic in Sketchflow, I mean, it serves a particular purpose. I mean, in Sketchflow, you know it's temporary. That's the intent of it. It defocuses the emphasis on perhaps certain aspects and refocuses the emphasis on other aspects. We think of AAA content. What is our value add? What is our focus that we're focusing on? We're focusing on the immersion aspect, and that's but the immersion aspect in a visual sense, and maybe a tactile, another kind of thing. But maybe the immersion aspect in a simulation perhaps is what is the quality of the game mechanic? Like, you know, if it is to teach a particular way of building an engine, then it might be nice if it represents exactly what the engine looks like from a AAA standpoint, but it might be better if it's more technically accurate. We know that this bolt is here and has this many threads, you know, for a mechanic. So, and when I've either, you know, used or done something with simulation, I am more thrilled. I could care less whether it's like blocks of color from like 1990 and it's just all, you know, bland. But if it's technically accurate, that gets me excited. And so maybe it's what is the value add? We cite the AAA versus other things. But have you found, the question then is, have you found over this course of time that certain elements can be defocused and other elements can be focused on and have some, there's always trade-offs, right? In a matter of investment.
I mean,
what's received.
Yeah, and I've got a whole other associated rant about the power of abstraction, and that's one of the things that games do really well, is they abstract ideas, is they can present a very complex idea as a simplified form, and that applies to the visuals as well. And and to any audio and any interaction is there's a lot of value in doing something that is simpler, that's a lot flashier, a lot less flashy. But communicating that to a client who really wants it to look like the game on their son's Xbox is very difficult. I know there's people in the room who've gone through the same process, and I don't know if anybody else has ideas, like how do you go through?
Run.
No, I did have a two-part question. The second one is concerning what you're saying there. The first part is, what's your, since you're in this space that routinely deals with government type of contracts or whatever you want to call it, what's your fail-pass ratio? Is it 1 out of 3, 1 out of 5, 1 out of 6? I'm just on the top of your head, just to get a ballpark for understanding a company who does this all the time, how much work it takes to actually fulfill a contract from a business aspect.
You mean win a contract or fulfill it?
Win it or yeah? Yeah, you're talking about winning?
Yeah, well, let's start with winning. I'm just trying to get just a ballpark understanding of,
It's probably about maybe 1 in 10.
1 in 10. So you put that much work on each of these, and you'll get 1 out of 10. Okay.
The amount of work that goes into the contract, you vary it by how much. And as a designer, this is an exhausting process, but it's also fun. Because so I'm spending my company's money. I'm getting paid.
Yeah,
so
but your company's earning their money back from that 1 out of 10.
Right.
So all that time you've lost, they need to make up for that in order to pay.
Well, that's the government rate. The company's also bidding on non-government things. Those things can have a different rate.
Okay.
And that's been better.
And the government rate's gonna go down.
Yeah.
Because there will be less.
Many targets of your company.
Okay.
I think the other thing that we've learned is we've got a couple of SDIR and SDIRs that it's a big surprise to me because we're a studio that's done some stuff and then we did one DARPA. And the big surprise to me was the amount of work after we got it to comply with military and government regulations with respect to having our camera system audited, setting policies and procedures and forms. The Breakaway does a ton of this work and they have a lot of people that are very, experienced in this, and they're just outside of Washington, and you guys have got the whole business on that. I think that's the one caution I would have for everyone else in this. This is not for the faint of heart.
No.
Right. You have to have a lot of processes in place. Yeah.
But it's very hard to get it, and the requirements. It's not doing the job for us was the easy part, but the monthly reporting, the filling out the forms, and understanding the acronyms and the payment systems and all of it. That's takes a lot of people to understand government contracts.
So on the same note, the non-government contracts, I hear it's a higher ratio that you guys are picking up, like 1 out of 3, 1 out of 5.
I'm not sure off the top of my head.
I find it to be 1 out of 3 to 1 out of 5, depending on how you are defining the denominator, like how much the traffic you have coming in. The more traffic you have coming in, the lower the hit rate's going to be because it's likely you have too many. Once you get above 1 out of 3, 1 out of 5, if it's because the amount of incoming is going up, the average will go down because most of that extra incoming is essentially people who are kicking the tires and aren't serious about spending to begin with. So the biggest problem, and this is something Breakaway is good at, I'm sure Dave is good at, is you have basically about one conversation to decide whether this person's worth any further investment.
Right, yeah, you have to run your cutoff.
That takes a skill to get used to.
Right. And the second part of the question was just kind of continuing a conversation about if they're expecting a AAA or X amount of work, how do you personally deal with softening that blow, that communication? Because I think any studio owner, such as myself or some other company owners, run across that and they have their own methods of dealing with that. And mine is not to deal with it and find a client that understands the price break, whether it be a website, a game, or whatever, having a reasonable, that has to have a huge budget, but it has to have a budget that's going to sustain the project. But that's just me. So there might be a schmoozing way that with a gene that I don't have.
Some of this really comes down to something that it's not so much a business side problem as a problem for the production team. Is as a designer, the trick is to describe, like, I still have to I'm putting together a design document, and I want that document to explain to them exactly what they're getting. So the level of precision that I have to put into a design document and even into a proposal is higher, because you need that, you can't make any assumptions about what their knowledge level is. And the other place where this becomes really important is concept art. Concept art will get you a deal in the entertainment world. If you have good enough concept art, when I was at Spark, we had one artist who was amazing at putting together these beautiful paintings that described what somebody was going to experience, and they captured it really well. Beautiful full color things that really, like, you looked at it and you knew what was going to be happening.
I told the whole story.
And you almost, you need to be very careful about what you're showing somebody who's not familiar with games, who's not familiar with this process. To get back on track a little bit so I can get to a little bit more of the pre-production stuff. The other side is, from writing these proposals and from trying to put together a design for somebody, the biggest issues that I've run into, that seem to cause me problems with actually getting these, is when you're looking at these proposals, you have to go through and build a checklist of everything you want, pull everything you could possibly, everything that they're looking for, and create this checklist and make sure you answer every single issue that they've raised. You can't sort of dance around issues, because you won't get the deal. The person who addresses everything they were asking for will get that deal. And then the weirdest one for me, just coming from entertainment to serious, is giving them references, giving them actual academic references, and doing all the proper formatting. It's going back to college and remembering how to write an appropriate report. And also this process of building up a whole collection of references that you can use to sort of say, this is why you want this game, this is why you want this approach, that have academic backing. Some other minor things that show up is partnering. I discussed the IARPA BAA. We're working with a bunch of different partners, and having an appropriate partner, having a partner who can fill in the gaps that you're lacking, especially for some games, some products expect you to provide the subject matter expertise. So finding people who can provide that subject matter expertise becomes really important. So I think we're running a little slow. I was going to do an exercise where I had some of you try and put together an idea for a game, but basically something is, at least as a thought exercise, think about what you would do if somebody was requesting something as dry and dull as a game to teach restaurant inspectors how to inspect restaurants. And the challenge that inevitably show up with something like this is that it's not going to be a big budget. If you're talking about something for states, you're talking about a very small amount of money, so you need to figure out the most efficient and interesting way you can present a problem of how do I train somebody to recognize what's a food violation and what's not a violation? How do you present as much of that content as possible? So, who's that? So, assume you've gone through this whole ugly process of getting this deal. You've gotten an entertainment deal. At this point, entertainment deals are structured very differently than the serious games and the corporate deals I've dealt with. There's a tendency to do a sort of a two-stage process that is ends up being much more useful. That you have an initial contract to sort of put together the game design document and the technical design and put together concept art and create enough that you could create a contract, and then that becomes a much more concrete statement of work. In serious games, most of that is done in that initial contract.
That's going to change.
I can hope so. I hope so.
It's going to change.
It's got to, because it's we in some of the previous sessions we've talked about this one of the things that's most important that serious games can most learn from entertainment games is this process of killing your babies, of figuring out what works and what doesn't and abandoning it. And you have this strange process right now where all of these features, like specific features, specific gameplays, is described in the initial contract. And you have, if you want to change that, you have to go through a whole process of changing the contract, which is just broken. And so if anybody has any way of negotiating out of that, and you say it's changing,
it may change. There's some people within the federal government at the executive level, as well as some of the agencies that have been advised to get this changed, and they're looking into how to fundamentally change it.
And I'm just saying, if you're working with a corporate client, it's sort of a similar problem. You want to make sure they understand that they're better off if things are less concrete.
Keep in mind that for corporate contracts as well, and even the government, less so government, but corporate contracts, they're usually not worth the piece of paper they're written on past the third paragraph that says we have the right to kill this work at any given time with 30 days written notice. So to the extent the corporate client is asking you for all that, the funny thing is they'll kill your thing in pre-production anyways. So you might want to actually use that to explain to them why, hey, let's have this first contract, because ideally it's better for you to be able to get a cleaner second contract, because that one will matter.
Sort of complementing what Ben said, it's also, I think, for those who are getting into corporate work, very difficult to manage a client to their previously made commitment. If they change personnel in the project on their side, or if they change other factors, writing a change control that increases their costs or lengthens your schedule it's much harder than you might think it is, because you've got a contract that you thought laid everything out.
Usually when that happens, my experience is the project just dies. Once somebody is brought in to change that moment, that's a huge probability that the project's going to die.
Positive conversation going on.
Yeah, well. So these are the pre-production for on the game side, and ultimately to some degree on the serious side. You're looking to produce a GDD, a game design document, a technical design document, an art bible, which is something that you don't see in serious games, and I really think could benefit a lot of them, which is really, it's a process of finding out what the style of the game is, of describing visually what the general look is. People are looking for specifics, and instead what we really need is something that is much more general, that sort of, this is the look and feel, this is how things are going to be, but some of that's also hopefully getting to a more stylized look. I mean, I know like Muzzy actually gets much more stylized than some of the stuff we have, which I'm jealous. So, the differences in serious stuff is that when you're doing a GDD for a serious game, you also have to start taking into account learning objectives, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and some of these sort of standards and methods of communicating with other systems. And this is mostly a technical problem, but there's definitely design considerations and some kind of what I consider sort of, in some cases, fun design problems, but they're design problems of doing a serious game that don't come in. And most of those have to do with learning management systems, and in the case of government contracts, integrating with HLA, which I'll talk about.
That was just the last page of this one. I was just to suggest one thing we've added, you probably do in your game design document. But we spend the first 2 weeks of the kickoff with a client doing business requirements. It's probably the kind of thing you said, their definition of first person versus your definition of third person. But that whole, what's the use model? Where's this going to get deployed? What systems does it have to talk to? What are your expectations for it? All that sort of stuff.
So, strangely enough, that's what we do in our starting with the kickoff. Before, I just wanted to make a quick note about, this is one of those terminology things that's gotten me into more trouble than just about anything else, which is the term storyboards, which if you come from an instructional design background, a storyboard is that. It's an exact description of what is going to be happening on every single screen, including all the text. And if you're coming from a games background, that's a storyboard. It's generally what's happening. There's a lot of filler where, text will go here later. You should probably think about this. This is the kind of interactions that are going to be going on. And it's really illustrative of a much bigger difference, which is when you're doing a game and you're planning for interactions, you're planning for interactions. You're planning for something that's going to be very dynamic. And if you're talking to people from a learning background, they tend to think in this sort of static way of, okay, here's the frame, and every content of every page is going to be changing a little bit. And so it's mostly when you're communicating with people with instructional design background, you want to think about that and plan for that, because those people could easily be involved in your project. In a lot of ways, they should be involved in your project. So the start of the whole process is a kickoff meeting. And this kickoff meeting is a meeting between you and the client, and it's an opportunity to really dig into what it is, how you're going to be doing this. It's the communication process, who you're going to be talking to, who gets approval, but then it also is like starting this process, laying down what things mean to each side, and starting to establish what the learning objectives of this game are. It's really the first big chance to dig into the meat of the project. And one of the things that needs to be communicated to people who are not familiar with games is what it means to change stuff. As a designer, I mean, designers are, to some degree, we're notorious for coming up with random new cool things to do or wanting to change things. But that's, in the case of dealing with clients, they may want to change stuff, and it's very dangerous. Now, the other side of this is getting them invested and getting them recruited. And there's a quote from Jesse Schell that I really like to go to at these points, and I actually think is completely valid, which is that everybody working on a game is a game designer. And that includes the people on the client side. Everybody is making meaningful decisions about what the game is, and that means that they are designers. And speaking as a designer, I tend to get, we all tend to get a little bit defensive of our territory because we have this sort of undefined role of we're designing games. And as much as game designers need to get over that on an entertainment game because everybody's got good ideas, it's even more important because in the case of serious games, because you're trying to get these people invested in the process and get them to understand what they're doing. And that means you have to make them passionate about the process of design. So that's always my little spiel. It seems to help. It's not perfect. So kind of go over that. Now, talking about consultants and working with consultants. When I first started in games, and when I've been working on games, a lot of these military shooters, that was my idea of a consultant. You may recognize that man, that's Dale Dye. If you've seen any Steven Spielberg movies recently, he's had some bit part. And he's also Steven Spielberg's big military consultant. And he's really good at his job of making people feel like they know about military stuff. And he's amazing at that. And he will actually, we would go through as designers and artists working on Medal of Honor games, we went through boot camp. And it was a one-day boot camp. But he would pretend to yell at some people, and he would pretend to make people do push-ups, and it kind of got that experience. And when I came into serious games, I thought that's what you did when you were working as a subject matter expert. You really need, you talk to these people, and they gave you a feel, and you started capturing it, and you were done. And you were done working with it. Now, in serious games, it's a very different process. There's this enormous amount of communication you have to do with the subject matter expert. And as a designer, there may be other people who are working with the subject matter expert. The instructional designers may be working with the subject matter experts, but the way that design and subject matter expertise interact is really, really important and really difficult, because you need to get all of the information out of these people to specifically recreate their world in a way that is believable to them. And there's a problem that I see with it. Is everybody familiar with the uncanny valley? So I think that there is a similar problem to the uncanny valley with domain-specific knowledge. Is the uncanny valley, people, what a real person looks like, and as you get close to a real person, but not quite there, they start looking really hideous. It's really creepy. Everybody remembers the Tom Hanks movie, except now I can't remember, Polar Express, where they had nearly perfect people, but they were sort of static and expressionless, and they were terrifying. The entire movie, based on a children's book, was terrifying. And the same thing happens in domain-specific knowledge. If you get somebody who is an expert on repairing ships and show them a process of what you do and show them that process partially, it will drive them nuts. And it will be that same thing of it doesn't look, it's close, but it's not there, and so it's really inaccurate, really difficult. And so the process is important to go through, this process of extracting this knowledge, and it's going to be an ongoing process because you get the first burst and then you kind of have to spit it back at them. You get another burst. And as a sort of illustration, what am I doing on time? Okay then, I won't go through that. I was going to give an example of working with a subject matter expert, but something to try for any designers. Sit down with somebody else and imagine you're going to be making a game that is about using vending machines, and sit down with somebody else and try and get every piece of knowledge that you need from them out of what you would need to make a vending machine game. So it's not just, oh, okay, I walk up to the vending machine, I put the money in, I make my selection, and that becomes my thing. You have to go into, okay, so if I put my money in, but I don't put in enough, how do I know? What's the feedback? If I put in too much money, what happens? If I make the decision, but the product is out, what happens? How do I make that decision of what product to get? What knowledge do I need displayed at me? And if you go through that process, you can start figuring out exactly how you would want to do that with a subject matter expert. And given that I only have a couple minutes, the other thing I'll say is before you ever talk to them, research their field. Know as much as you can before you ever sit down with them, because otherwise the first time you talk to them is wasted.
As an aside, tell the client that you need time to do that, because sometimes they want to throw you in the meeting with them right away, and they have no concept that you want to show up prepared to be able to talk to them and interrogate them. They think that it doesn't work that way. And so you want to tell the client, yes, I'd like some time to go read, could you write a reading list? Because sometimes they don't give you that option.
So I managed to not quite get to nearly enough of my design content. I apologize to any designers, but covered a lot of stuff. So questions, comments, anybody?
I'll just say one of the most nitpicky, especially if you're doing military contracting, some of the most nitpicky people you ever see are soldiers. Like soldiers that are on the field, especially if they've been deployed at all, they will tear apart every little detail of your game. Because they have nothing else to do. They're just playing your game and then just criticizing it. So that's probably the most critical subject matter expert I've ever worked into.
And that uncanny valley problem, the domain specific, is particularly bad with soldiers. Because they're not even, that's all they've been living.
Yeah.
It's everything.
For 4 years they've been cleaning their gun, and then all of a sudden the spring's in the wrong place, and they're pissed about it now.
It's awful.
Question about money. In the entertainment world, I assume if you are fortunate enough to have a successful product, you will get revenue from that for a lengthy period of time, right? Money will keep coming in.
That's usually the theory.
Now,
Hasn't always worked
I
that
try to
way.
caveat that as much as possible, but in the serious games world, there's no such thing as royalties, is there? There's no such thing as residuals. If you are successful, you deliver the product, and it gets used by whoever it's intended for, but your revenue has a hard stop at the point of delivery.
Well, and that's sort of true, but not, because if you're successful, if you've made them something that's good, that serves their purposes, they want more. And they want more of the same thing, and more in more detail. And that's something you have to think about when you're building your tools, when you're designing your tools, when you're planning for what it is you're going to be making, as far as how you're going to be doing your production process. Is if you plan this as a one-off and they come back and they say we really like more, it's really painful. So more than even making entertainment games, the tool side has been really important, and the design of tools has been really important.
I have an exciting comment. exciting quote for that: successful projects are never completed. Only failing projects complete. Because if it completes, it's done. If it's successful, people want more. So I heard that one time, successful projects.
It's great.
We found if you're transitioning into serious games, you have to understand that although they may come back and want more, the same timeline applies for funding all over again, potentially.
Yes.
Just because they want more, they don't have funding. You have to go to different agencies. Now it's a real project. Oh, well, that's got to be funded by a completely different organization. It's a whole start over again process, and it takes a long time.
I think also there are a lot of potential for different business models than work for hire to come in, because they're going to take radically different organizations at the development level, as well as different approaches to the way the targeting works. But I would argue that the most successful serious games vertical in the world is Exergaming, and that is entirely royalty based for some of those developers. And it's entirely consumer based. And it's, I wouldn't mind having a dollar per copy of EA Sports Act. So I think that there's opportunities. The other thing you can look at is whether or not there are applications of your tools and your engines, and negotiate into the process the ability to have those for other projects. And get that clarified in your contracts. What's the reusable right of the technology investment you make? It's not always amortizable, but if you can, then you have an opportunity.
One thing I might mention with you're talking about government contracts, and you end up with a successful completion of the project. The company still has the IP for that, the intellectual property to that, although the government has certain rights to that product, even if it's developed under government funding. But if there's a viable product that comes out of that, then of course then that can go out and be sold on the public market to other groups as well. It's not just exclusively kept to the government marketplace.
Yeah, the fantasy, although I think they stopped trying to support anything like this. There was the case of Full Spectrum Warrior, where a company got paid to develop the serious game, and then they turned around and sold it as an entertainment game, and not a bad entertainment game, and reasonably good at teaching squad tactics. So I think they kind of won on all points, but there's less ability to do that in a lot of cases. Like some of these, like a lot of what you do ends up going into open source. So you're required to make it open source, or certainly open. It's always available to the government. So once you've made one thing for the government, they always are allowed to use that.
Well, earlier you mentioned, I've always grown up knowing that it's hard to get the actual contract, because my dad's a contractor, and so I've grown up knowing that. But then I was curious, once the contract is attained, what is the success rate, producing a good product? The grant I've been working on with the university I attend, we produced the product to fit the somewhat vague terms of the contract, but it wasn't what some of us would consider, it wasn't as successful a product as we would have liked to have produced, because of some difficulty with SMEs, because for some reason they couldn't give us any of the soldiers that we needed to talk to for an entire year. And so I was curious, what is your experience with, the success rate of a product once you have that contract?
Well, using your quote about what success is, if success is continued work, it's probably about 50-50. If success is getting it done, you always get it done, but is it good? Because in a lot of cases you have problems dealing with getting contact with the subject matter experts, or the biggest problem I've actually seen is getting feedback back from them. So you get contact with them and you give them a bunch of stuff, and you pull a bunch of information out of them, and then you get back to them and you say, here we go, here's this, what do you think? And they go, and because it's a giant pile of paper, usually they won't look at it. It's getting that process. So this is something we put together recently for a client, where we were doing dialogue trees, and they're these hugely complicated dialogue trees because it's a soft sales trainer. And this is what I had to do to get feedback out of them. Because if I gave them just dialogue, if I gave them a Visio file, they couldn't look at it, they couldn't, that understanding what it was really difficult. But if we printed it all out, taped it up on a wall, and started taking notes on it with them, that got the feedback. But whatever it is you need to do to get that feedback, or to get the contact, and if you can't get the original contact, that's the nightmare.
So, since you mentioned Visio, I've switched over to Personal Brain mind mapping tool to do what I used to do with Visio, because it allows you not only to make much more complex charting and relationships between pieces, but you can also go online and edit with your client from a remote distance. So it's a really powerful program for the same type of purpose.
But not if they can't see. I mean, that's the thing about this was this put it so it's a very visual process using any mind mapping, using Visio, and we were dealing with expert in sales, and they're not visual people. So we had to make the visualness of it as explicit as possible, and that was the advantage of doing this. Or
they're
whatever.
Not screen people either. We've done the same technique with clients. Say, why don't you print it out and put it up on a wall and look at it, and we've gotten better feedback. The other question though, if you're using Visio, I'm assuming that you're also embedding data in those, so that file is going to go directly into.
We're actually using a different tool to
But that does that.
So it's similar. There's not a direct import. That's the plan right now. It doesn't, but that's my hope. But it was as much. I find, at least as a designer, having a visual representation of what I'm trying to do is really important. But for me, on a screen, it worked.
Right. Yeah.
But for the client, it wasn't.
Isn't this akin to the entire exercise of the serious games that we're talking about? This is a serious exercise, okay? This design process, interaction and communication, and the achievement of an achievable task, which is to complete that document. Okay, we have many tools that are available to us, and most of them fail fabulously. And so I think in this image we see that, okay, this works. Why does it work? Well, because it can represent more what we're envisioning. So imagine if this wasn't pieces of paper on a wall, perhaps this is a simulation environment where that's a virtual wall in a virtual environment, but you can get the same visceral feel in that virtual environment in VRML, 3D perhaps, or something like that, where he and the client remotely, perhaps, and there may be projects that already do this, but remotely perhaps could interact on that wall together and not be co-located. And that itself would be a training for the achievement of what kind of process completing a dialogue. And that could be, a simulation or a serious game to do what? To teach the task of completing an interaction dialogue on a virtual wall in a virtual environment. So I mean, all roads lead to Rome, right? But I think that this is the key point is there's some things in our world that are very difficult to visualize and achieve the goal that we're trying to achieve. But we have a lot of tools which fail us. Visio and Microsoft Office, all other kinds of things. And this is why we're here, I think. How do we do that?
So
in military context or industrial or in business?
Maybe at some point, but I think what you're describing is actually one of the great dangers of this idea that, it was on one of my earlier slides, but there's this idea that virtual is a game. And that's such a dangerous and bad impression.
Okay,
so,
and maybe you
so
disagree with that.
So if I was to make a game about building dialogue, I would not do this in a virtual environment. I wouldn't. That would not be good training. Because I would find a much better way to do this. Because I don't think, this was an ad hoc way to deal with the problem, and it was great, but for anybody who's had to do a conference in Second Life, exactly. So beyond the half hour it takes you to try and get into the conference because it's supposed to be saving you time when a phone call would have happened already, beyond the fact that one of the guys has shown up as a blue dragon, beyond the fact that, beyond that, any of that, it's the virtualization is not the virtualization of the right thing. Is if I wanted to do a virtual conference, ultimately, GoToMeeting with a couple of shots of somebody's faces is vastly more effective. And there's an important lesson for games in that, which is that you can't just take a concept, virtualize it, and pretend you're training. You have to actually distill what's important out of it, turn that into something useful, turn that into a process that is engaging, and use that. So.
I created a game called The Day in the Life of a SME, which helps me make my first initial relationship with them. So it helps me let them know I do understand how busy you are and that I still need your time.
Can I borrow that? So I think we're now well over time. So.
Good job.
We hope you found this recorded session informative. If you're an established or aspiring game developer in the state of Georgia, we invite you to become a member of the GGDA in order to participate in our monthly networking and educational programs and to experience Siege firsthand. Information on becoming a member and attending chapter meetings can be found at ggda.org. Information on Siege can be found at siegecon.net. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll come back for the next episode of the Georgia Game Developers Association's official podcast. Music for this program was provided by Professor Shy Guy. For the GGDA, I'm Cecilia Holman.